Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. Today, we're taking a look at American Crusade, Our Fight to Stay Free by Pete Hegseth.
Interesting choice.
Yeah, it's definitely a book that makes you think.
I can imagine. So this is like a call to action, right? For, I guess, patriotic Americans?
Yeah, you could say that. Hegseth, he really wants people to stand up and defend, their values. He sees all these threats, these serious threats to the nation.
Oh, I see. Well, that makes sense. I mean, coming from him.
Right.
Yeah, his background is, well, it's definitely relevant here. Army veteran and, of course, FOX News commentator. So he's coming at this from, a pretty specific angle.
Definitely. Yeah. And that perspective, it's front and center right from the beginning.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
In the first chapter, it's called Our American Crusade. He kind of lays out this core concept of it's not just a political fight. It's bigger than that. It's like a battle against ideologies, ideas that he thinks, are fundamentally against American freedom.
Wow. So it's pretty intense right off the bat.
Yeah, for sure. And he's not, he's not messing around. He really sees this as like a struggle for the soul of America, like a clash of values with huge, huge stakes.
It seems very personal for him.
Oh, it totally is. He actually talks about his own journey, his own transformation. He used to be more as an establishment Republican, but he became a big Trump supporter.
So the 2016 election was a kind of a turning point for him.
Huge turning point, yeah. And he connects that to this whole argument.
I see. So how does he connect the dots there?
Well, he's basically saying that the way he sees it, the left, they don't just oppose Trump politically. It's deeper than that. It's like they reject the core of what it means to be American, according to him.
That's a pretty strong statement.
Yeah. He even says, the left hates Trump because they hate us, which is,
Wow. Aligning himself very clearly.
Yeah. He's drawing a line in the sand.
Right from the start. So where does he go from there?
So from there, he goes into a whole series of these isms, these ideologies that he thinks, are threats to American freedom.
Okay, so what kind of isms are we talking about here?
The first one he really digs into is in chapter 2. It's called Americanism. That's his term.
Americanism. Okay, so he's defining what it means to be American.
Exactly. And he contrasts that with what he calls the globalist agenda.
Yeah.
So it's like his definition versus, what he sees as the other side.
That's interesting. So I'm curious, what's his take on Americanism? What does that actually mean, according to him?
Okay, so for him, it's all about a few things, like national sovereignty, having control over your own borders, and assimilation. Like he believes immigrants should assimilate into American culture.
So very much focused on the nation.
Yeah, and that's the opposite in his view of this globalist worldview, which he thinks wants to break down borders, erase national identities, all that.
So he's setting up a pretty clear dichotomy here.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Us versus them, kind of.
Very much so. And to really drive home the dangers of this globalist way of thinking, he brings in some examples. He quotes President Macron from France, and even Andrew Cuomo, former governor of New York.
Interesting. And what do they have to say that fits into this?
Well, they both been critical of nationalism. They see it as maybe outdated or even dangerous.
So he's using them to show that this globalist thinking is mainstream, not just fringe.
Exactly. He's saying, look, this is coming from, the top.
Pretty powerful. Does he have any more concrete examples, anything that really brings this to life?
Oh, yeah, he does. He talks about, remember that whole thing with the NBA? With Daryl Morey, the manager?
Vaguely. Remind me.
He tweeted something in support of the Hong Kong protests.
Oh, right. And China got really upset.
Big time. And for Hegseth, this whole incident just proves his point. It shows how, being economically entangled with China, it gives them so much leverage.
Because American businesses are, so dependent on the Chinese market.
Yeah, and that puts American interests, at risk.
Makes sense. So it's not just about abstract ideas for him. It's about real world consequences.
Exactly. And he connects it to American companies putting profits ahead of patriotism.
So it becomes a moral issue, not just an economic one.
Right. It's about values, about what it really means to be American in this, globalized world.
That's a big question. How do you balance those things, the economic interests, with the national interests?
Right. It's complicated. And he seems to think that America's gone too far, that
Wow.
we've prioritized globalization, at the expense of our own sovereignty.
So he's pushing back against that trend.
Definitely. And he keeps developing this whole Americanism idea in the next chapter, chapter 3. But he starts addressing some of the pushback you might have.
Oh, I see. So he's anticipating the criticisms.
Yeah. Like one argument you can make is that his kind of nationalism, it sounds a lot like racist nativism, right?
Right. That's a common critique.
And he knows that. So he tries to get ahead of it.
And how does he do that?
He says, look, American nationalism, it's different. It's not about, race or ethnicity. It's about these ideals, these ideals of freedom and opportunity. And he points to, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution. Like, those are the cornerstone.
Those are like the bedrock.
Exactly. And any attempt to, reinterpret them, to change them, that's an attack, on the foundation of the country, in his view.
Hmm. And what does he say about the left in this context?
Well, he sees them as trying to do exactly that.
Yeah.
Rewrite history, redefine those values. It's this ongoing battle for the narrative.
Okay, so he's pretty concerned about that. Does he offer any examples of, where he sees that happening?
Oh yeah, he has a lot of examples. But to show that, it's not just America, that other countries, they care about their own national interests too. He talks about a conversation he had with the Australian Prime Minister, Scott Morrison.
Ah, interesting. And what was the gist of that conversation?
It was all about, national sovereignty. Like, even in a globalized world, that's still important.
Right, right. So he's trying to show that this isn't just like an American thing. It's a global concern.
Yeah. And that leads into, his whole critique of leftism, which is what he tackles next.
Yeah.
In chapter 4, he really goes after it.
Okay, this is where he gets into the nitty-gritty.
Yeah. And he makes this really clear distinction between, like, liberals and leftists.
Yeah.
Like, those are two different things for him.
Interesting distinction. So how does he define each of those?
So liberals, I guess they're okay, but leftists, he thinks they're like radical. He says the Democratic Party has been taken over by these radical leftists who basically hate America.
Wow, that's a pretty strong accusation.
Yeah, and he points to like specific policies, like open borders, reparations, socialism. Those are like the hallmarks of this, this radical agenda.
So in his view, those policies are like fundamentally un-American.
Exactly. And he goes so far as to say that these leftists, they exploit like the ignorance of regular people.
Yeah.
Like, they use these deceptive lies, these sound bites that sound good, but they're not based on history,
So it's like a deliberate manipulation in his view.
Totally. It's all about gaining power, holding on to power. And that distrust, that suspicion of the left, it's like a theme throughout the whole book.
Okay, so that's something to keep in mind as we go forward. So where does he go from there? What's the next ism on his list?
Well, in chapter 5, he tackles globalism.
Ah, so he's circling back to that.
Yeah. And he's really hammering on this idea that globalism is a threat, like a direct threat to America's, sovereignty and economic interests.
Right. We touched on that earlier with the China example.
Exactly. He's saying that because of globalism, America's become way too dependent on China for everything, really, for our economy, for essential goods.
And he sees that as a huge vulnerability.
Huge. And he blames, policies that have put, global trade ahead of America's own interests.
Does he talk about any specific institutions or people who he sees as like pushing this globalist agenda?
Yeah, he talks about his own experience with the Council on Foreign Relations.
Oh, interesting. He was a member, right?
Yeah, he used to be. But he's kind of disillusioned with them now. He thinks that these institutions, even though they're, they sound prestigious.
Yeah, they have this aura of like authority.
Exactly. But he thinks they're actually like pushing an anti-American agenda.
Wow. So it's not just about like foreign powers, it's coming from within too.
Yeah, that's his point. And as you might guess, he links all this back to illegal immigration.
Right, which is a big issue for him.
He's huge. He loves Trump's border policies, building the wall, all that. And he really goes after sanctuary cities.
So for him, this is all connected. Globalism leads to, open borders, which leads to illegal immigration.
Exactly. And for him, it's not just about like policy. It's deeper than that. It's about protecting American citizens. upholding the rule of law, which is like the heart of Americanism for him.
So globalism is this like multi-headed monster for him. It's weakening America economically, culturally.
And it all ties back to this question of, like, who are we? Where do we draw the line? Who gets to decide what it means to be American?
Yeah, those are fundamental questions, and he's definitely tapping into a very, very powerful issue, especially with, his target audience. It's about preserving America's identity, like you said, against these forces that he sees as trying to dissolve it.
And he's not pulling any punches. It's a very, very strong narrative.
Powerful and definitely emotionally charged. So what's the next threat he tackles? Where does he go from here?
So in chapter 6, he kind of shifts gears a little bit.
Yeah.
He starts talking about genderism.
Genderism. Okay, this should be interesting. And what's his take on that? So what's his angle here? How does he approach this whole genderism thing?
Well, he actually starts with a kind of a personal story
Yeah.
about attending a feminist group meeting back when he was in college.
Oh, okay. So he's trying to establish some common ground, maybe.
Yeah, I think so. He's saying, look, I used to be supportive of, equal opportunities for women. It's not what I'm against.
So it's not feminism itself that he has a problem with.
Right. It's what he sees as like this extreme version of it, this push for like gender fluidity, rejecting the idea that there are only two sexes.
So he's drawing a distinction there between like traditional feminism and what he calls genderism.
Exactly. And he's very clear that, he's all for equal opportunity, but he doesn't want to like blur the lines between men and women.
He's drawing a line in the sand there.
Definitely. And to illustrate this point, he brings up Title IX.
Title IX's the law about discrimination in education, right?
Yeah. And he says, it was intended to protect women, to make sure they had equal access.
Right. Equal opportunities in education and sports.
Exactly. But now he thinks it's being used to like allow biological males to compete in women's sports.
Which he sees as unfair, obviously.
Yeah. He's saying, look, this isn't what Title IX was meant for. It's creating this uneven playing field.
So he's framing it as a women's rights issue, almost.
Yeah. It's not about, being against transgender people. It's about protecting women, making sure they have a fair shot.
Interesting. So he's really trying to navigate this complex and sensitive issue.
Yeah. And he's definitely appealing to a certain sense of fairness.
Yeah.
Highlighting what he sees as the unintended consequences of this gender ideology.
It's definitely a hot button issue. A lot of people have strong opinions on both sides.
For sure. And he's not shying away from it. But let's move on to chapter 7. Here he tackles socialism.
Okay, another big one. And how does he approach this? Does he start with some like, big historical analysis or?
Actually, he starts with a story about his son.
His son. Okay, that's unexpected.
Yeah, he talks about explaining the difference between, capitalism and socialism to his son.
And how old is his son?
I think he was pretty young at the time. But the point he's making is that like his son just got it, like it was intuitive.
So he's suggesting that the principles of capitalism are like natural almost?
Yeah, like it's just common sense. You work hard, you get rewarded. That's how the world works.
Interesting. And then how does he go after socialism? What's his main critique there?
Well, he makes this really bold claim. He says that socialism is basically a new form of slavery.
Wow. That's a pretty strong statement.
Yeah, it is. He's saying that under socialism, the government, they benefit from, the work that people do, but the people themselves, they don't get ahead.
They're not free to like reap the rewards of their own labor.
Exactly. And to support this argument, he uses an example that I think a lot of people can relate to.
The VA.
The VA,
Oh,
the Veterans Affairs healthcare system.
Well, and he's pretty critical of it. He points to like the bureaucracy, the inefficiency, and he says, this is what happens when the government takes over healthcare.
So it's a warning against like a single payer system. Exactly. He's saying, look, the government can't do it as well as the private sector can. And the VA is like the perfect example.
It's a powerful image for sure, and one that resonates with a lot of people, especially veterans who have had, firsthand experience with the VA.
Yeah. He's really tapping into a sense of frustration there. And from there, he moves on to secularism. It's chapter 8.
Okay, so from economic systems to religion, or the lack thereof.
Right, and he starts this chapter with a story about Kanye West.
Kanye West,
Yeah.
the rapper.
Yeah, he talks about Kanye's conversion to Christianity, and he presents it as like this really powerful example of the impact that faith can have.
Especially coming from someone who, was so deeply embedded in secular culture.
Exactly, and he's highlighting like the importance of a religious upbringing. Like even if you stray from your faith, you can always find your way back.
Right. There's this idea of redemption, of faith being a guiding force in your life.
Yeah, and he contrasts that with what he sees as the secular left's like rejection of religion. Like they want to get rid of it altogether.
So for him, faith is essential. It's the moral foundation of America.
Exactly, and he argues that the founding fathers they understood that
Yeah.
that you need faith to have a moral compass.
And he sees the left as like trying to erase that.
Yeah, he uses a few examples like Princeton University. They removed the word God from their
Yeah.
motto.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. And he also points to like the acceptance of the hijab, while at the same time, people are criticizing Christian symbols.
So he sees a double standard there.
Exactly. It's like it's okay to express other faiths, but Christianity is being pushed out.
So he's concerned about that trend, the secularization of America.
Very concerned. He sees it as like a real threat to the values that the country was founded on.
Okay, so we've gone from gender to socialism to secularism. What's next on his list of threats to America?
Well, in Chapter 9, he tackles environmentalism.
Okay, so climate change, all that.
Yeah. But he starts out by saying, look, I get it. We need to, take care of the environment. There are legitimate concerns there.
So he's not like a complete climate change denier.
No. But he's very skeptical of what he calls like radical environmentalism.
So it's the extreme version that he takes issue with.
Exactly. He thinks it's become like a religion itself, and he doesn't buy the whole, climate change narrative.
He's a doubter.
Big time.
Yeah.
He brings up like past predictions that didn't come true, and he accuses the left of, using fear tactics to push their agenda.
So he's not convinced by the science.
Not at all. He even uses the word hoax at one point.
Wow. Okay, so he's pretty firmly in that camp.
Yeah. And to make his point more concrete, he tells this story about a town in Texas that switched to wind power.
Wind power. Okay, and what happened?
Well, according to him, it was a disaster. Like, it didn't work, it was expensive, and it actually ended up hurting the people who lived there.
So he's using that as an example of like the unintended consequences of these green initiatives.
Exactly. He's saying, look, these policies, they sound good in theory, but in practice, they don't work.
Yeah.
And they often end up hurting the very people they're supposed to help.
It's a powerful argument, especially if you already have some doubts about, the whole climate change thing.
Right. He's appealing to like common sense practicality. And that theme continues in Chapter 10 when he starts talking about elitism.
Elites. Okay, so now he's going after the elites.
Yeah. But he makes a distinction between like being an elite and elitism.
Okay, subtle but important difference.
Right. Like it's okay to be successful, to be smart, or whatever. But elitism it's like this arrogance, this belief that you're better than everyone else, that you know what's best for them.
So it's not just about being in a position of power, it's about how you use that power.
Exactly. And he thinks this elitism, it's a big problem on the left. Like these elites that think they can, dictate to everyone else how to live their lives.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like he's got some personal experience with this.
Oh, yeah. He actually talks about his time at Princeton and Harvard.
Oh, right. He went to those schools, didn't he?
Yeah. And he talks about how, like, disconnected those places are from the real world, from the struggles that everyday Americans face.
So it's this ivory tower mentality.
Yeah. And he thinks it leads to, like, bad policies because these elites, they're so out of touch.
They're not in touch with the needs of the people.
Right. And then he connects this elitism to political correctness.
Political correctness. Okay, so that's how he sees that fitting in.
He thinks it's like a tool that these elites use to silence people, to make them afraid to, speak their minds.
So it's about controlling the narrative, shutting down dissent.
Exactly. And he thinks it's created this climate of fear where people are afraid to, say what they really think.
Because they're afraid of being, labeled as racist or sexist or whatever.
Right, and he's tapping into a real feeling that a lot of people have, this sense that you can't speak freely anymore.
Yeah, that free speech is under attack.
Exactly. And this whole idea of a battle, like a cultural and political battle for the heart of America, it really comes through in chapter 11, where he talks about multiculturalism.
Multiculturalism. Okay, so now he's tackling identity politics.
Yeah. And he's careful to make a distinction between like multicultural and multiculturalism.
Okay, so what's the difference there according to him?
So multicultural just means like, society with different cultures. But multiculturalism, as an ideology, it's about emphasizing those differences, putting people into these different groups.
Instead of focusing on what unites us.
Exactly. And to illustrate this point, he tells this story about some Latino Trump supporters.
Latino Trump supporter. Okay, so that's interesting.
They were being criticized,
Yeah.
like attacked, because they didn't fit the expected mold.
They weren't supposed to be Republican.
Right. And he's using that to show how like the left uses identity politics to control people.
To punish those who don't, toe the party line.
Exactly. And he goes even further. He says that this focus on differences, it actually leads to more racism.
More racism. That's a controversial claim.
It is. But his point is that like by putting people into these separate groups, you're creating this us versus them mentality.
Right. You're emphasizing what divides us instead of what unites us.
Exactly. And he thinks the better way is to focus on our shared identity as Americans.
To find that common ground.
Yeah. It's definitely a provocative argument. And then in chapter 12, he gets into Islamism.
Islamism. Okay, so now we're getting into some really sensitive territory.
Yeah, this is a tough one, and he's very upfront about his views. He thinks Islamism is dangerous, like a real threat to freedom, not just in America but globally.
So he's not just talking about like individual terrorists. He's talking about a broader ideology.
Right, and he focuses on what he sees as like its aggressive nature. The way it tries to spread and impose its values on other cultures.
So he's painting it as like an existential threat.
Yeah, very much so. And he argues that the left, they're actually making things worse. Like their policies, their whole approach to Islam is naive,
They're not taking the threat seriously enough in his view.
Exactly. He thinks they're too tolerant, too accepting. And that's making Western societies vulnerable.
So he's calling for a much tougher stance.
Definitely. And to kind of give some historical context to his argument,
Yeah.
he brings up like the Barbary pirates, the Crusade, stuff like that.
So he's going way back.
Yeah, he's trying to show that this conflict between Islam and the West, it's not new. It's been going on for centuries.
It's part of a long historical pattern in his view.
Right, and this sense of urgency of we need to wake up and confront this threat. It really comes through in the last couple of chapters where he shifts from like analysis to action. So he's sounding the alarm, basically.
Yeah, you could say that. He's definitely trying to shake people out of their complacency.
So in these last couple of chapters, what does he want people to do?
Well, in chapter 13, it's called The Front Lines. Education in Israel. He talks about like the specific areas where he thinks this battle needs to be fought.
Okay, so like where are the front lines? According to him.
Well, he sees education as like a huge one. He thinks the left has like totally taken over the education system. They're indoctrinating kids with all these anti-American ideas.
So what's the solution there? What does he propose?
He's a big advocate for like school choice, He thinks parents should have more control over where their kids go to school.
For like homeschooling, private schools, stuff like that.
Exactly. He specifically mentions Christian schools, He thinks those are like a good alternative.
So it's about like taking your kids out of the public system altogether.
Yeah, if that's what it takes. He really emphasizes the importance of parents being involved, Like don't just hand your kids over to the system and expect them to come out okay.
It's like take responsibility for your kids' education.
Exactly. And then he also talks about Israel.
Israel. Okay, so how does that fit into all this?
Well, he sees Israel as like this beacon of freedom, this country that's surrounded by enemies, but they're still fighting. They're still standing up for for their values.
So it's like an inspiration.
Yeah, and he talks about how like America and Israel, they share a lot of the same values, you know. They're both democracies, they're both fighting against tyranny.
So we should support them.
Yeah, he's definitely a strong supporter of Israel, and he sees them as like a key ally in this global struggle against the forces of darkness, basically.
Okay, so that's chapter 13. What about the last chapter, the grand finale?
Well, the last chapter is called "Make the Crusade Great Again." So, you know, he's not shying away from the Trumpian language.
Right. And what's the message there? What's his big call to action?
Well, he's basically saying, look, America's in trouble. We're facing all these threats, these isms, you know, that are trying to destroy us from within.
So what do we do about it?
He says we need to fight back. We need to engage in this American crusade, you know, to reclaim our country, to save our values.
Okay, but how? Like, what does that actually look like?
Well, he gives some concrete suggestions, like run for office, you know, get involved in your local community.
So like grassroots activism.
Yeah, support conservative organizations, you know, donate your money, donate your time.
And just like speak up, right? Like,
Yeah.
don't be afraid to say what you think.
Exactly. Don't let the left silence you.
And what about like the overall tone of the book? Is he pessimistic? Is he optimistic? Like where does he land on that?
It's interesting. He definitely paints a pretty dark picture. You know, he really thinks America's at a crossroads. Like we're in danger of losing everything.
But he's not giving up hope.
No. He ends on a note of optimism, I would say. He believes that America can be saved, but it's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of people, you know, standing up and fighting for what they believe in.
So it's like a call to arms, but also a message of hope.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. It's like, look, things are bad, but they don't have to stay that way.
Yeah.
We have the power to change things, but we have to act. We have to be engaged.
So it's a powerful book for
Yeah.
sure. It's thought-provoking, it's challenging.
Definitely. And even if you don't agree with everything he says, I think it's valuable to understand his perspective, you know, to see the world through his eyes, even if just for a little while.
Like it's like taking a deep dive into a different mindset. You
Yeah.
know, trying to understand where he's coming from, even if you don't necessarily agree with all of his conclusions.
Exactly. It's about engaging with different perspectives. And Hegseth's book definitely offers a thought-provoking one. Don't just take our word for it, you know. Explore these ideas for yourself and form your own conclusions.
And on that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive into Pete Hegseth's American Crusade.